All right. Hello. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty good.
I'm excited to talk to you about writing and first-time books.
Yeah, I mean that's mostly the kind of problems that I'm dealing with as a book coach,
Good.
people who are trying to write their first book.
Yeah, it is scary, the first one. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Right, yeah. Well, I'm a writer,
Hmm.
and I've written 15 books. The first one about 25 years ago. So I was kind of lucky to be in on the sort of the tail end of the good old days of writing, where you could make a pretty reasonable living from
Hmm.
advances, and that's what I did. Mostly nonfiction, some fiction, and gradually, over the last 10 years, the landscape has changed. I mean, partly
Hmm.
almost totally due to the internet. So lots of advantages, lots of positive developments in terms of micro publishing
Yeah.
and people being able to get their book out. But for mainstream authors, it's a bit like Uber and taxi cab drivers. The poor old taxi cab drivers found that Uber was sucking up a lot of the other rides. So that's kind of propelled me into professional writing coaching because I was
Yeah.
doing it unprofessionally for years, helping people
Yeah.
reading manuscripts. And I realized that by charging for it, I actually A, enjoyed it a bit more, and B,
Surprise.
surprise, surprise, and B, put more into it and
Yeah.
they get more out of it. So it's like it's a wonderful thing. And so I'm really happy to help people achieve their dream because I was helped in the past by
Yeah.
mentors and so on. So it really makes a difference. I think the single biggest difference to a new writer is knowing another writer who has published a book.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
just somehow makes a massive difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's been about 25 years since your first book was released. Which book was that? Was the first one?
Yeah, the first one is called Angry White Pajamas, and it
Yeah.
was about a year I spent training in traditional Aikido with the Tokyo Riot Police. So it's a pretty intense experience, and it's a sort of memoir, but it
Hmm.
also won the Sports Book of the Year award in
Wow.
that year. So it's kind of a book that crosses lots of genres, really.
Hmm.
And after that, I wrote a lot of travel and a sort of history, popular history, and as I said, a couple of fiction titles.
Hmm. So what was that like writing your first book? Do you remember kind of the problems you struggled with?
Yeah, very, very clearly. I was because I've been writing for quite a while, doing short stories. Already tried to, I'd written a kid's novel, but it had kind of petered out. So I was really cognizant of the main problem of first time authors, which is giving up. And you give up for various reasons. We'll probably talk about those. But
Yeah.
that first experience I had, I made a routine that was based on this Aikido course I'd done because the course had only been 4.5 to 5 days, depended, 4.5 to 5 days a week, and on the mats only 5 hours. So, and
Hmm.
in that time, I'd become a black belt, and I wasn't particularly talented. So I thought if I follow that same routine for writing, I must be able to succeed. I just must. So it was really the whole strategy was based on remove all obstacles that I can envisage coming down the line. Um, and I knew, for example, taking breaks would be catastrophic. I know that after even a short break, it's really hard to get back into writing again. So
Yeah.
I didn't have any holidays or any interruptions in that period.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think for me, I find it a lot easier to just get my head into something and just keep going. It's why I've never embraced the Pomodoro technique because 20 minutes is nothing. Like it would just completely disrupt anything and I wouldn't get anything done. I just really need to
Yeah,
just get into it and keep going until my head is just fried and then I move on to something else or
yeah,
take a break. But I really need to just get stuck into a
yeah,
writing project.
yeah, yeah. No, you're completely right. And there are some people who only, I don't know, it kind of might work with book coaching because I
Mm,
see them and they do a small amount each week, but it
mm,
but it adds up. But
yeah.
it's dependent on kind of seeing me and having me
Yeah.
apply the willpower. If you're doing
Accountability.
yeah, if you're doing it on your own, it's a lot harder, and you probably do need to barnstorm it.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So what do you think is the biggest problem that first-time authors face?
Well, I think the biggest problem, and the one that is putting them off from starting, is a feeling of of being overwhelmed, possibly at the beginning, but sometimes they do a few pages, but very, very quickly getting a feeling that the whole project's way too big for their mind.
Yeah.
And this is especially bad with fiction.
Mm,
With nonfiction, usually you've already laid out a framework, um, and you kind of are confident that you can do it. And the problem is this: it's impossible for a human mind really to sort of encapsulate an entire book.
yeah.
It just doesn't work like that, you know. And if you do, you're using your left brain, which isn't really designed for that. You know, basically the entire book is in your right brain. It's in your sort of subconscious. You have to trust that subconscious, and you have to give it a skeleton or a framework so that
Mm,
it can rely on you and calm down. And so that's really what I try to do is I don't try to go all left brain on people and say, you know, this you can work out every single character, every single this did, partly because that's really boring and it just doesn't work. You know, you've got to trust yourself. You know you can write the book. Your inner sort of tacit knowledge is all there, but the right brain gets really easily overwhelmed. You know, it's just a timid little creature in the corner, and it needs to be protected. So that's really what I aim to do is overcoming that sense of overwhelm. But what
mm.
about you? What about your first book?
Well, the thing is, I do nonfiction, and
Yeah,
as I'm hearing you say this, I realize why I've never been able to write fiction because I have a very structured brain, and so when I sit down to write a
yeah,
nonfiction book, like I map out all the chapters, and they may
yeah,
change as I write the book, and new things may come. I might dump out other things, but I start out with a structure. And I think that's how I approached my first novel that I started writing, and it didn't work that way. And it was so slow going, and I just put it on the back burner and thought, I'm just going to write what's easy. So
yeah,
I've continued to write nonfiction because that's what's easy for me.
yeah,
But yeah, I've really struggled because I like the idea of writing non fiction. I
yeah,
like the idea of writing a novel. I
yeah,
have ideas, but oh, it's just really, really tough. So yeah, my first book was easy because it was nonfiction.
yeah, yeah. I think that even though you said, you have a structure and so on, I think you're still trusting yourself a lot because
Yeah.
when you do chuck things out and everything, I mean, one of the main genres I've written have been travel books
Yeah.
because when you go on a journey, it's almost like the first draft.
Yeah.
You're going here, and you might even have told people and rehearsed it. So in a way, it's it is much easier to do
Mm.
that. And quite often, I've used a travel format as a sort of spine for a book, even if it's
Mm.
not even a travel book. So one of my books, The Extinction Club, which is actually a novel, is based on the this sort of rare deer. But what I did is the sort of spine of the book, I made it like I'm sort of finding out information and I'm going here and I'm going there. So it's like a journey. So,
Hmm.
and it was stuff I'd done, it was research I'd really done. So it's that's one way of kind of overcoming that um, fear that you don't really have enough is to externalize your research and um, sort of tell it as you were doing it. And this
Mm.
somehow you just need to have these bridges. I mean, that's what the structure is. This
Yeah.
listing all your chapters is just giving you a structure that so that you don't feel overwhelmed, basically.
Mm.
And, I mean, there are other ways around the overwhelm feeling. For example, if you are lucky enough to have a private income and you don't have like two screaming kids, you've got to go take to school, and you can sort of probably check into a hotel near a beach where they'll cook all your meals. I reckon that might be a lot easier because you
Mm.
zone in and you don't panic because everything's kind of laid on and you can sleep when you want.
Yeah.
I think that might be easier. But if you're trying to fit that writing
Yeah.
into an everyday life, then you probably need all the help you can get in terms of structure and planning and so on.
Yeah, I used to do my workations once a month, which were kind of that. It was like my own personal writing retreat. I would just go for 2 nights somewhere, stick my head in the book, write as much as I could, and I would do that once a month. And that's why I was writing so much for a certain period of couple of years ago, because
Yeah.
I just had these really focused writing retreats.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think for most people it's really, really hard to find those big chunks of time.
And how many words did you manage to get done in one of those workations?
I mean, some of my books have been kind of pulling together other materials that I've written. So I remember one weekend, I think I did about 20,000 words
Pretty good.
of a book,
Yeah.
pulling from some things I already had, putting them together, but also writing a lot of new material as well. So it had a really good foundation after one
Yeah.
workation, and then kind of continue it on the
Yeah.
next couple. And I use them for writing, I use them for editing my own work before I got it ready to go to someone else. Yeah, they were just really, really productive.
Yeah. I think that that's true. And I've never, well, I did one once. And in fact, I wrote the bulk of this kid's novel staying at somebody's, and I borrowed somebody's house to do it.
Mm,
That's sometimes quite good. As someone
mm.
I know who goes, well, it's actually Will Self, the writer Will Self, books into a travel lodge, you know,
Yeah.
any old travel lodge, because, you know, he doesn't want distractions,
Yep, yep.
just wants regular, and stays there for 10 days and just
Nice.
hammers out whatever he needs doing. So
Yeah.
that's another way of overcoming, yeah, that feeling. I mean, the problem with overwhelm is, especially with fiction, and this is much less case with nonfiction, but with fiction, you can't stop thinking about it, you know, and that
Mm,
means your left brain is over engaged because, you know, all of that sort of verbal chitter chatter, that's all the left brain. So somehow you have to shift into this much calmer right brain zone, and the successful novelists I know are people who are very happy to slip into a sort of a, I wouldn't say it's a trance state, but sort of like a dream world where they're writing, and
mm.
it's a happy place for them. It's not like,
Yep.
oh God, you know, I'm going in there, you know, that they like the characters, they like the world, they want to be in there. So,
Mm.
and then when they come out and they're doing their everyday life, that's kind of separate. But for some people, and I include myself, and I know other writers who are like this, both the left and the right brain were like fully engaged. So as soon as so the writing itself, it wasn't a feeling of being in a particularly happy place. It was like, oh my God, you know, I'm here. And then when you weren't there, your head was just filled with potential problems. And in a way, this is going to be a paradox. I think often the most creative writers are not fiction writers, they're non-fiction writers,
Mm.
because in fiction there are so many possibilities that you could do anything. And
Yeah.
if you're a non-fiction writer, you can just think of 1,000 different ways. Sorry, if you're a creative person, you think of 1,000 different ways to do everything. And that's
Mm.
just like overwhelm. You know, you
Yeah.
literally don't know what to do. And there are methods that I use for that, like making lists and all of that sort of thing. So you can sort of break it down. But that feeling that, oh, why don't I do this? Oh, he could go here. He could meet so and so. That's bugging you as you're walking around, and it makes you
Mm.
everyday life. You know, you become pathetic at doing anything because, you know, you're just, your head is so full. And I've only, well, relatively recently kind of latched onto this more meditative way of doing fiction, and literally going into a zone, and
Mm.
and into a world, and not thinking that you can just necessarily write about anything you choose. You've got to find that kind of inner world that you
Mm.
populate with characters, or whatever. And some writers go into that. I mean, the writer Alistair MacLean, who wrote these famous thrillers, which became, you know, lots of blockbuster movies in the 60s and 70s. I mean, he used to just sit in an armchair, just in the corner, for like a month. You know, every day he would be
Wow.
sitting there. He would literally be in this sort of semi-trance state of, and he'd just be working the entire plot out. He would be in that world.
Mm.
It was a happy place for him to be. You know, he wasn't like he was anxious or what.
Mm.
He was just happily exploring that world, and gradually getting all the characters, all the situations, probably dialogues, who knows. And
Wow.
then you would sit down and hammer out. There were all these books about 75,000 words. You just hammer
Mm.
it out because it was all, but it was this
It
dream.
already happened in his head.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, and that's sort of creating that dream state. So I would say now to somebody who is wanting to write a novel, I would say, first of all, just just practice with like a short story.
Mm.
Just practice going into that state where you're like, it could be when you're walking, it could be when you're lying in bed, but it's like a happy place where the whole elements of the story are. So you kind of
Mm.
get used to it being,
Mm.
and and then gradually expand it. And I mean, a novel can be an expanded short story, or it could be
Mm.
like 10 short stories all linked together,
Mm.
being in the same place. So it's not impossible to, but it's just, I just think that would be a way
Mm.
where your brain would not become infected by this overwhelm sensation.
Yeah, yeah. So you also said you make lists. What kinds of lists do you make? Is
Okay,
it lists
so
of what's possible to within the story or?
what I do is whenever I get to let's say any situation which requires you to choose something, um, and you haven't sort of intuitively just come up with something like, oh yeah, I love that name. So you don't
Mm.
know. So I just make a list from 1 to 10, 10 names, you know,
Mm.
10 things. Let's say he gets to a gate. I mean, you can do it for almost any situation.
Yeah.
He gets to a gate. What does he see? Because, for some reason, I don't know. I'll write 10 things. Often it's about number three. It's
Mm.
not the first one. So if you're writing very, very fast,
Yeah.
you're always going to choose the first option.
Yeah.
Um, but quite often, yeah, it's about three. I mean, it's only rare that it's number 10,
Mm.
but it takes all the heat off. Uh,
And
the
sometimes you have to see the options that don't work
Yeah,
before you
yeah,
can
yeah,
realize the one that does
yeah,
work.
yeah, yeah. And so that's another option
Mm.
for fiction. The just turn everything, just take the heat out of everything because it's this sort of pressure. Oh, should it be
Mm.
this? Should it be that? And then I have this rule in lists. If it's if I can't choose, if it's not obvious, it doesn't matter. So
Yeah.
if it's not obvious, it doesn't matter. So just random, it's fine.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I'm quite interested to hear about how Alfred Hitchcock used to, because he used to collaborate to
Mm.
plots, and he would he would be people sometimes got annoyed, like screenwriters got annoyed with him because halfway through he would suddenly say, "Oh, let's have some cocktails," or "How about this joke?" And he would just break off, and he was really careful to keep it very, very, very light because he knew that the moment you start getting really heavy about
Mm.
creativity, you end up usually repeating yourself, dragging yourself through the mud, doing things that are wrong. That it's all got to be that. Again, it's back to that old right brain thing, that very light, playful sense. So how can you keep that? And yeah, one way is you just keep breaking off. So you only do these sort of creative sessions when you're in that mood.
I
Alternative,
think that, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's really important what you said about being in that playful place rather than taking the project too seriously. Because I
yeah,
think when we do take a book too seriously, that's when we kind of fall into perfectionism and it has to be just right in
yeah,
every detail. Whereas if we're playing with it, then we can open ourselves up to other
yeah,
possibilities that we might not
yeah.
have seen otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, it's the key. I mean, just you know, there's two powerful energies out there for writing. One of them is playfulness, and the other one is anger. People who rant, and get really angry. But I would much prefer playfulness as the source of a, and it engages people too, and it really frees you up. Uh,
Yeah.
but you have to trust that you can do it, and
Hmm.
you also have to. This is something that's come across me recently. I've been talking to professionals in the crew, who interact with creative people, and they're all serious. And sometimes I get a bit nervous when I start talking about, oh, you've got to, I don't know, give stupid names to. They were talking about uh, designing something, and I was saying, well, you got to give stupid names to it because then people will do this, and I realized their whole world, this sort of corporate world, is extremely sort of serious and po-faced, but they don't understand. All creativity is a bit childish. It is.
Yeah.
It's a bit childish.
Yeah.
I don't care if you're designing the biggest skyscraper in the world. There are going to be moments of childishness of which will seem like childishness in the
Mm.
creativity of thinking things through. And you've got to be comfortable with that side of things. So it helps if you are a bit childish anyway.
Mm.
You've got to encourage that playful side at the same time, accept that you don't get the really good stuff without that sort of slight sense of childishness or mucking around
Mm. Mm.
and
Experimentation.
experimentation. And sometimes, as you say, it won't be perfect, but you won't get that good stuff without the other stuff. So sometimes you've got to accept that there might be a very clean notion of a
Mm.
project, and of course editing can cut out a lot of the other stuff, but
Yeah.
there's always usually things are flawed, written objects are flawed, and I think it's very important to avoid that. You're right.
Mm. Yeah. So one of the things that you've mentioned to me, and I think this is interesting, it's a very creative way of looking at it, is to kind of look at the book as like a murder inquiry where you're a detective that's trying to figure things out. Tell me about that, because I think that mental image of someone pasting pictures over the wall and putting strings between things is really, really creative. And I think that's something I think most authors haven't thought of.
Yeah, well, it started from when I was doing travel books, come back, I've had
Mm.
the photos and I would sort of pin them up. And sometimes I've had objects I would have picked up. And then I began to realize, yeah, this was good. It
Mm.
creates, it keeps the vibe.
Yeah.
Uh, when you're sitting down, you're back in that space. And I also found that I always love those bits in movies, even if it's a total cliche, but apparently they do it. Is this sort of the picking up, they put the pictures up and they
Yeah.
remove them around. And
Yeah.
it was always a bit like one of those mind maps, those Tony
Yeah.
mind map things, which I find really useful, by the way, to when I have loads of stuff and
Mm.
no idea how to connect it. I just stick it all up like that and draw lines. And it doesn't seem to matter. At first, I thought, oh, it was really important where the lines went, but actually doesn't seem to matter. It's just a way of training your sort of right brain, your tacit knowledge of the sort of extent of the project. So um, uh, you just have to sort of make the gestures. It's really weird. You
Mm.
don't actually have to be you don't have to be like a real policeman and actually make, these things are really serious. It's
Yeah.
just, oh, I'll connect that to that. And as long as it's kind of looking good and you've got the pictures up and that feeling of um, thinking of it as a murder inquiry in the sense of you don't know the answer, but you're gonna get there in the end,
Mm.
is kind of reassuring mindset, because it's like you kind of might feel when you set out to write, but you need to know all the answers before you
Yeah.
write it.
Yeah.
But the process of writing the book will answer serious questions you may have no idea. You might have even thought of the question when you start.
Mm.
Um, So again, that's like the murder thing. You turn up clues, you change the way you think, and the whole inquiry might spiral off in another direction. Um, so it's just a sort of metaphor for doing something where you pretty much know what you're doing, but there could be lots of surprises. And the
Mm.
notion of clues also can be structural for the book as well. This is a key sort of object or
Mm.
play or idea or something.
Mm. Mm. So do you have any other tips for first-time authors who are struggling with structure?
With structure, okay, my main thing with structure um think of a line, draw a big line. Sometimes I get a big
Mm.
sheet of paper
Mm.
and just draw a big like arrow up the paper and just start putting things down on one side to start with, which would be probably events, and or you could have the arrow going down. So it's
Mm.
as time goes by, but just put the events, but don't worry too much. Just have a vague idea of how they should fit in, and then on the other side, put down the elements of of what the argument might be in the book. What
Mm.
needs to be said first before you can progress to other things. And then you just sort of start rearranging them. But what you're doing is you're creating a visual idea
Mm.
of what the book is. If you
Yeah.
can't do that first, I am a huge fan of mind maps. So just get
Mm.
again, I say make it fun and make it playful. Get a huge sheet of paper, A2 or something,
Mm.
different pens, and write those all the different elements of the book. Just trying to think of every element of the book around there, and then start, doing this linking, and you'll get some sense of just by the number of lines coming out of which are the more prominent elements of the structure, and then
Mm.
put them into the thing, into the book. So that's what I would. That's for sort of nonfiction. For
Mm.
fiction, if someone is really stuck, I say the simplest technique you can use is the three-part repetition. So think of what your novel is,
Mm.
and the basic idea. And usually people don't have it all worked out. So let's say the novel's about, I don't know, a guy who's a fireman, and he's living with his wife and he's not getting on with her. That's part one.
Mm.
Part two is exactly the same, but it's something has changed. So he's living with another woman. He's got rid of that woman. He's no longer a fireman. I don't know. And part
Mm.
three is exactly the same. It's a fireman, but he's done something else. He's done something else. So already you've got to now think of how you go from part one to part two to part three.
Yeah.
But it's repetition, and the secret of storytelling is repetition. So this is like a really simple way to create a story. So you're using, by repetition I mean repetition of things that have come before and
Mm-hmm.
reusing them in a new and creative way. So you've already got all these elements and you're just saying, okay, well, I've got to change them, because otherwise how do I get to this second situation and how do I get to this third one?
Yeah.
And it's the simplest mechanism in order to, and it's very satisfying to watch, because actually lots of films are based on people usually making the same mistake twice, and then the third time they've worked out, oh, I
Yeah.
do it differently. So I mean, like with the fireman story, he could be like a different woman each time, and then by the
Mm.
third time maybe it's back to the first woman, or maybe it's like a new woman, I don't know. So um sometimes it's just, you just got to be very simple.
Mm. And then
um
you add the details as you're going along, but the
yeah, yeah.
basic structure is quite simple.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest problem most first time writers have is they don't really know how to tell stories.
Mm.
And they have um, there's a lot of misinformation around about stories. So, I mean, this is why writing that, I do this thing on LinkedIn. It was a Substack called
Mm.
Superstory. But really, it's based on a lot of work I did I trained with Keith Johnston, this improv director, and Keith Johnston's written this is a really important thing for writers. Get Impro and Impro for Storytellers by Keith Johnston.
Mm.
Because both those books are an absolute goldmine of information about how to create stories. And the basic insights, I mean, there are really, really lots of misnomers about stories. So, for example, people think stories are about characters. Stories are not about characters. Stories are about relationships.
Mm.
Obviously, you have to have characters to have relationships, but it's the relationships that interest us. We are not
Yeah.
in isolated characters. Stories are not about conflict. People say, oh, yeah, it's all about conflict. It's not about conflict. Conflict is a symptom. Stories are about submission and domination. So, how someone submits and how someone dominates is what we're interested in. And recently, I've been watching all these K dramas. I mean, Terrible Addiction on Netflix, and most of them feature bullying. They feature
Mm.
bullying and interrogations. Right, bullying and interrogations are pure drama, because in a
Mm.
bullying situation, someone's submitting, and we kind of wonder, oh,
Mm.
how much will they put up with? How much will they put up with?
Mm.
Then the worm turns, and they get their revenge, and then the bully has to submit. We love that. So it's this submission and domination. And Keith Johnson came up with this because he said, I was hearing all this stuff about drama that people were telling me. And he said, and then I went to see pro wrestling. Pro wrestling is pure drama. It's drama for the proletariat.
Yeah.
You have the bad guys, the good guys, they submit, then they dominate. And then often there's this switch where the bad guy suddenly becomes a good guy, which of course is
Mm.
the thing that happens in soap operas as well. So, um, it's really important as well to think about that submission and domination thing when you're trying to create drama. And it's also true for writing nonfiction or memoir. If you want to create drama, just think, who's submitting here? How are they who's dominating? How are they dominating? And what will be the point when it flips? Um, so that's kind of really important to help people. I mean, I know people who've written entire novels and still will tell me, I don't know how to do a story. And of course, intuitively, we can do this. We can tell stories because we're storytelling machines. We don't need someone like me to tell them. But when you get stuck and you don't know why, and it's gone wrong, you do. It helps if you know the map, and the map of storytelling is the basic map is reuse stuff that has gone before in a new and interesting way. So it's a bit like gag telling. Think about how a gag works. Something is introduced and then it's reused in an interesting or humorous way later. Somebody chucks a banana on the floor, skin on the floor, someone else slips up on the banana. But it's the banana, has appeared, it's been reused. And so when you're making a story, what people often do is that they just keep looking forwards and sort of, oh yeah, we'll have a funny character here and we'll do this and we'll do that. And they're actually running away from the story. And that's why their stories never end. This is another problem with oh, I've written 100,000 words. I can't see any end to it. Well, the reason they can't see any end to it is they're looking the wrong direction. They've got to turn around and look at the beginning and realize that their job is simply to unpack everything that was in the beginning, everything that was on the platform, what Johnston calls the platform, which is the relationships and the setup and the environment that is at the beginning, that is tilted. He calls it the tilt. It's upset. Everything is upset. It's not really an instigating event. It's really just a general upset that will affect everyone. Everything is then in free fall. And then you unpack all the possibilities of these relationships and the environment. And then finally it achieves a new stability. So yeah, by focusing on those things, you shouldn't really get into too much trouble.
But if you do, then you should need to hire a book coach.
Yeah. If you do, you need to hire a book coach. I mean, we could talk about that. What is the function of a book coach and why it is really, really helpful? Because writing is it's a lonely business. You have probably learned to be a writer by reading other books. And it's quite a big jump to go from reading books to writing books. And it helps to have someone along who's done it and knows how it's done. And as I said, the best thing is if you have a really good friend who happens to be a published author, you are way ahead of the game. But not many people do have that. And if you join a class, the teacher, well, they may or may not be a published author. They're not always published authors, even in university creative writing courses. Also, in order to be a teacher on a creative writing course, you have to have done some academic work. There will be an academic side to it, which really pulls against it. I mean, writing's a practical activity. It's really got nothing to do with academia. I mean, the fact that academics have books and also write books is almost like an accident. I mean, their whole process, and in fact, we're seeing it now. Lots of kids who do courses now don't even have books. Everything is done online, or the printed materials all online. There is sort of like no need for books. So it's important to not assume that academia and book writing are sort of connected by an umbilical cord. And so, the other thing, my other big problem with creative writing groups is, though they are generally better than doing nothing, there is the possibility that you become very influenced by the other people in the group. I mean, this is classic group dynamics. So what happens is you have original ideas, but then you discover that people in the group don't really like them. And there's one person in the group who everyone likes their ideas. Really like them, their ideas to start with. But then after a while, funnily enough, you start liking their ideas too. Sort of the groups are always dominated by one or two people. And in my limited experience of doing these creative writing courses, they are not often the most interesting people. They are just dominant people.
Yeah.
So there are all these things that will get in the way. And often the people who come on the creative writing course, what they really like is to talk to the one-to-one to the
Yeah.
course tutor. And they usually have a chance to. But it's only like 20 minutes. And just, it's a bit like, I don't know, how much can a school do for a problem kid? Not much.
Mm.
But if the problem kid has a special tutor who they see every day, that kid can really probably be turned around.
Mm.
I'm comparing first time authors as problem children, but that,
But
yeah. And
yeah. Yeah. And I was just talking to a potential new client the other day, and she has been working on this book for, I don't know, 10, 15 years and had joined a writing club, a writing group, and had gotten so much feedback over the years from this group that it was like she was kind of not sure what worked,
yeah,
what didn't work, because obviously everything's subjective. Everyone has their own
yeah,
opinion, and she'd
yeah,
just been kind of subjected to so many opinions that it was like, I don't know where I am right now.
yeah. No, that's so true because as a writer, your main aim is to develop an inner sense of certainty that
Mm.
what you're writing is good, people want to hear it, and your decisions are right. I always think if you have a chance, there's a famous documentary about Prince. And the thing about Prince was he was really certain about what he wanted to do. He just, some of it came out brilliantly, some of it didn't. He didn't care. He was just
Yeah.
very, very certain. And you want to be like that. The
Yeah.
problem with these groups is it's encouraging the opposite. It's
Yeah.
basically, as you said, oh, this is a good idea. This is a good idea. And it's diluting that
Yes.
powerful sense of this is right. And you have to nurture that sense because it's a bit fragile, and
Mm.
obviously you don't want it to become a kind of delusion or
Yeah.
sort of, a kind of strong opinion. It's not. It's kind of different from that. It's not a strong.
Mm.
It's just like an inner quiet certainty about where you want to go.
Yeah. Mm. Well, on that note, I think we've got tons of advice for the first time author. And if anyone has any questions, where can they find you online and get help?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm happy to talk to anyone for free for 20 minutes. After
Yeah.
that, it's you got to pay, but it's I've got a website, roberttwigger.com.
Mhm.
It's not hugely mobile friendly, but you can probably read it on a mobile. And that's probably the best place. Also on LinkedIn and Facebook and things like that. But if you go to roberttwigger.com and then email me
Mhm.
on robtwigger@gmail.com, it's on that website as well.
Yeah.
You'll be able to get in touch.
Great. Great. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed our conversation. I think new authors have a lot of great tips to get started with. So thank
Well,
you.
thank you, Holly, and I've enjoyed talking to you as always.
Thank you.